Ruler School is brought to you by Happy Little Hug Factory and these amazing patrons. Extra special thank you to guest lecturer patrons Brody Harris, Lance Albertson, and Monica. Thank you for your support. Enjoy the video. Hey there everyone, DMO73 here, bringing you another feature match for the week. Today I am playing the Time Spinning Witch Lockdown. It's blue-green. It's kind of a combination of the elements that I liked from a lot of the lists from GP Rome, as well as obviously bringing it back into New Frontiers. So some of the stuff we saw in Collinsville. I'm playing against Trey Jacobs and his most updated Dark Tree control. He plays Dark Tree a lot, and so he kind of has been working on it with Winds of the Ominous Moon, and so he's kind of been able to update it, and so we wanted to see kind of how it went. So Time Spinning Witch Lockdown, if you weren't aware, it uses Distortion of Time and Dinosaur Rising, with Time Spinning Witch's ability to pay for activated abilities and awakenings to make them happen sooner, so that you just force your opponent to not be able to recover their stones and just really get ahead of them on curve. So huge thanks to just a lot of the people that I reached out to kind of talk about time spinning, and as well as just the lists that I was able to share or kind of use as a template. I really like this list a lot. It's a lot of fun, and I think you're going to see kind of why as we play here. So I'm going to be on the play here in game 1 against Dark Tree, so let's see how it goes. Things that I'm looking for in my early hand is, you know, draw cards, as well as maybe a Distortion of Time and cancel stuff to be able to kind of protect, as well as things like Lorite against Dark Tree. Turn 1, I have the Idol of Magic. Idol of Magic is a 1-drop that says I can pay 1 to filter it into any other color, and then when I have to sack it as well, and when it gets sacked to the graveyard, I draw a card. So the interesting thing here is Time Spinning, which is Time Will, can be spent on activate abilities, which Idol of Magic counts as that. So Time Spinning Witch's effect when it's idles on field essentially says produce 1 of any color and draw a card for free. Hit the Dinosaur surfacing there. I'm not terribly too worried about losing it early, because I get the chance to stick my other idol, and I've got like Severing and lots of other backup stuff that I can kind of make use of until I can draw into another surfacing or just a Mosasaurus. Playing the Rezard here. The idea here would be uses the Rezard to maybe potentially stop me from early committing to a Distortion of Time if I'm not immediately going to use the God Art. Thinking about if I want to do anything before recovery. Deciding against it, calling for stone. Hitting another Deep Wood, so 3 stones, 3 colors. It's great for being able to cast cards, but it's not so great for being able to do Judgment of my ruler. Calling a stone over there, hitting a Heaven's Rift. He's going to swing for 5, and I say that's fine. I'll go ahead and take that damage. This is definitely a grindy match. I have to be very careful because I don't want to give Trey too much advantage in the RFG until I'm ready to kind of strike and take advantage of him being really tapped out. That's the point in which I really want to push a lot of damage, because then he can't really make use of all the cards that he's just removed from game, and he kind of just like, well, he just kind of spirals out at that point. Don't do anything at the end of his turn, so I just go ahead and draw. I'm thinking about it anyway. So at the end of his turn, I'm going to go ahead and flash in a Lorite here. The reason why I'm casting the Lorite here at the end of the turn, it might seem a little weird, it's because one of the things that I like to use in this deck that some of the lists from the Rome GP used was 7 Disciples. I think this card is just very, very strong, especially in this deck because it doesn't really have anything typically in the middle game, but 7 Disciples is this really great kind of hate magnet, and so what it kind of has to try to do is it forces your opponent to start tapping themselves out sooner to deal with this kind of recurrent threat of 7 Disciples, therefore setting up to a better situation. It's going to go ahead and hardcast the Severing here. I'm going to go ahead and Farrors that, which resolves, so then my Disciples is going to gain all the effects. I won't gain life because I can't gain life, but it does let me get the Rezard off the board because it'll have Swiftness, +2/+2, First Strike, Precision, all of those effects. And so what this does now is this essentially says to Trey, like, you have to spend your turn dealing with this card, otherwise it's going to be this continual threat. And if you don't, if you do try to it, then it's tapping you out and making you very vulnerable to the Time Spinning Witch lock. This is one of the reasons why I think having mid-range threats is good for the lockdown deck, and sometimes there's kind of 2 ways you can play it, right? Where it's this hard all-in on the control, but also this kind of like creating this kind of tempo, I guess, variant, where it has some threats in the middle ground. I personally prefer this style just because it gives me more ways to stop set my opponent up to fall into the trap of the lock, and I really enjoy that. Trey's going to go ahead and commit to a final battle here. He's going to pay 14 just to clear the board, which is great for me. I mean, he final battled, it didn't hit any of my Mosasaurus. It just hit, you know, it didn't tap him out very much, but it did spend a good chunk of life for some not super massive threats. He's going to play the Ray. I'll go ahead and sever. He casts the Ferris spell, so the Ray is going to resolve. So draw for my turn. Ray is a big threat for me right now, primarily because if it does trigger and flip into 0, I'm in a pretty bad way, because 0 is going to protect the stones from Mosasaurus, so I kind of have to deal with that right now. Thankfully, he is tapped out. So what I'm going to do here is use the Time-Spinning Witch Will to produce blue off of the altar and draw a card, cast Dinosaur Surfacing, which will safely resolve, and then I can bring up Mosasaurus and tap down his 2 green stones and a white stone. The reason why I'm doing this to tap down those specific stones is the green stones means that he doesn't get Cancel Will early, which means that I have a much easier time in being able to answer the Ray with something like Lorite if I have that in my hand, or a Keys Call to stop the effect to be able to trigger. Like that, I have the Lorite ready in hand. He doesn't have a way to be able to cancel it, so the Ray is going to stay on the Ray side, which is absolutely great for me. Hitting another Heaven's Rift at this point, very nice for me. Any turn that I don't have to worry about seeing any kind of green. Decides to go ahead and just pass turn. Go ahead and attempt to swing for 15. He says, I'm going to try to miscalculation that. Use the effect to produce green, I believe. Time-Spinning Witch into altar to produce green to potentially, you know, get something like a Ferris spell. Don't see it. So the Mosasaurus is just going to die, but it's fine because I still have that Floating Will to make use of later, and I can still use it for a Dinosaur Surfacing. So I can spend another 4 here. Cast Dinosaur Surfacing and go get another Mosasaurus and kind of can still keep him locked down while also being able to keep up all these stones. So I'm just targeting the same ones. So once again, he's going to recover just his 2 Heaven's Rifts, which means that I can successfully kind of answer the Ray pretty effectively. Calling for stone, I hit a Spirit Stone there. It's 100 to see under the overlay. So that's the stone you can sack to draw a card. Moving into recovery, attempts to trigger the Ray. I'll respond by casting the Dragon Lord's Breath to produce Time Will, so I'll draw a card off of it and try to bounce that card back to his hand. So this is a nice little cycle, and then if he wants to try to replay the Wraith for this turn, it is going to be the only card, so once again, he taps himself out to do it. Sees an Ancient Magic Stone here, has to pay 3 life to keep it up. So feeling very ahead of things right now. I've done a very good job, I think, in this match of keeping kind of Trey on the back foot. And I haven't even necessarily used any of my my Distortion of Time lockouts yet. And thankfully, keeping him off green has been very, very helpful. Because I can kind of safely make my Mosasaurus or Time-Spinning Witch plays without having to worry about anything getting canceled in that regard. And Time-Spinning Witch is definitely a deck that doesn't really mind just casting 1 card a turn, so severing isn't always the best based on the matchup. He's going to go ahead and cast Glint of Insight here. Thinking about what I might see. Maybe thinking about whether he wants to cast a Severing Winds or if he wants to see a Distortion of Time. I'm not necessarily sure if the Distortion of Time would even be a good idea to call because it fits in the graveyard. He does have a res, and he doesn't have unless he has a Resard, then it just makes it easier for me to go ahead and lock him out next turn. If he does have a Resard, it's not too bad because he can just play it unless I have a Severing Winds, which then punishes them that way. So it's a little bit weird. The 2 cards I have in hand are a Lorite and a Severing Winds, so he knows that he has to unfortunately just leave those 2 stones up. He can't cast the Ray, which completely leaves him open for the next turn. Top decked into that 7 Disciples, calling for stone. Paying 3 to play that Disciples. Attempting to trigger to gain all of those effects. And I'm feeling at this point in time that it's probably safe for me to be able to start swinging in. So I'm going to swing in for 9. and then hit him with a Lorite and Mosasaurus, all for a lot of damage. It would be a total of 25 cards removed from his deck. Don't see a Rezard, which is always nice to have happen. So my thought is that hitting this many cards is my ideal, is to try to hit as many final battles as possible, just to kind of essentially lock the game out, to where even if he was able to, I'm trying to rip as many resources as possible kind of out of his hand, especially since I'm leaving so much will open, to be able to just hard cast the Severing Winds that we know I have in my hand. So right now my hand is Lorite Severing Winds, so I'm not really worried about Rezard in the fact that I can just, if he's going to try to bring it back with Tree, I can Lorite it. If he tries to hard cast a final battle to wipe the board, then I can just hard cast the Severing to stop it. Is kind of my thought process here, is why I feel comfortable in trying to move forward, and hitting him for that 24 is a lot of cards at this point. And it looks like he has double Lorite, Ray, Blood Spray, and I think Life and Death Struggle, I think, is the other card, which is the each player discards a card and sacrifices the creature that has the highest cost. So it's kind of the almost replacement for the Soul Hunt that we have in this kind of era. He's going to go ahead and draw 2 and mill 3 because of negates the damage from Blood Spray. Gonna go, he's thinking about exactly what playline he wants to do here. He's gonna try to cast the Life and Death Struggle, thinking about whether or not I want to respond to that, or kind of what I want to do with that. Make the decision to go ahead and attempt to sever. That is going to resolve, which is excellent for me. He's gonna call for Stone, leaving himself with just 3 will. He knows at this point that the only card in my hand is Lorite, which doesn't necessarily do a ton, and his Rezard can get very, very big here. His Rezard at this point would be a 12/12, which would be able to kill anything that I potentially try to swing in with it. Casts Conky's Moonbeam Butterfly here for a 2-drop. Imagine probably grabbing a Rezard. Just to have a body on board. That can answer pretty much, you know, any of my particular attackers. The problem here is that he's tapped out. So going into my turn, I'm pretty safe to kind of do whatever I need to do. And he doesn't have too many cards left. So I could ultimately, if I really needed to, leave the Mosasaurus up, and then just give the flying to the Disciples and hit for 9 more, and just leave Mosasaurus up. The problem becomes at that point in time, do I give him enough attack to be able to crack back at me with a final battle, right? It would cost him, he's got plenty of will available, so a final battle wouldn't necessarily cost him a lot of life to cast for just 1. But in realizing that what my top deck is, it's just Dragon Lord's Breath, I can bounce the Rezard back to his hand and swing in for lethal. So that's game 1, and so we'll move into game 2. Putting me on the draw for this one. We'll see if I can get the lockdown kind of as consistently as I did in the first game. Thankfully enough, I was able to keep the Ray kind of consistently off board and consistently locked down on the Ray side, because the second it flips to 0, it becomes a massive threat, because Mosasaurus has become dead, and my only lockdown source at that point becomes a Distortion of Time, which ultimately in the course of the game I can only use twice. Calling for Stone, hitting that Ancient Magic Stone off the top, deciding to pay the 300 life for it. Spending that first turn to cast Thought Control. Shayla's Return, Distortion of Time, Keys' Call, Altar, and Disciples are the cards grabbed. It's kind of a rough spot There's a lot of really good cards in there that all cost 1. Distortion of Time isn't necessarily the card you want to discard, because it just makes it easier for me to do the God Art. The real threat there, I think, which Trey identifies, is that Disciples, so he's going to make me discard that. I don't particularly mind because I have the Altar, so I have a little bit of early game dig, as well as the Keys Call, which is much nicer for being able to dig as well. I'm going to go ahead and play that Idol, so I can start drawing cards as well if I need to. Gives me access technically to any color on Trey's turn. I'm going to go ahead and cast the Ray. I say that's fine, I have no response to it. Drop a turn. Hitting my second Spirit Stone. It's a little unfortunate to not have access to a lot of blue will. Decide to pass the turn at that point. Draws to recover. In response to the trigger, I'm going to use my Energize to attempt to bounce the Ray back to his hand. Saying if you want to recast that Ray, you have to go ahead and tap out to try to do it. My main reason here that I'm doing it kind of this early is I don't really want to be taking damage, and forcing him to kind of slow his tempo down just to keep replaying Ray over and over again works out better for me, because it gives me more time to be able to make better plays, as opposed to just Keys Calling, where I cancel it, I draw a card, sure, that's great, but he gets to keep Ray on board. So now I've made it a minimum of he has to recommit to playing the Ray, which taps him out and gives me a bigger opening to be able to make a play. Calling for Stone, hitting a Deepwood. I'm going to go ahead and cast that Distortion of Time from my hand. Looking at the top card, trying to decide what I want to keep, or whether I want to keep it or send it to the bottom. I'm going to go ahead and decide to keep it. I believe it's a Dragon's Lord Breath that I see, and then I pass the turn. Attempting to let the trigger happen, I'm going to use Time Spinning Witch's effects to produce blue, time, spend it on the altar to produce blue, draw a card, and then I'll attempt to Keys Call it, which is great because it lets me draw another card, and Ray stays on that side. So again, a part of the matchup is very much, in terms of for Time Spinning Witch, is one, Ray management. We want to keep it off the board, because we have so many bounce spells that can hit things like Rezard that he's not a terribly huge threat to be able to just kind of keep it going off the board. But really, it's about making sure that a 0 doesn't hit the board, because having that once per... everything having that once instant protection is practically a death sentence for Time Spinning Witch. It's very, very hard to get rid of. Casting Kaguya's Moonbeam Butterfly, attempting to grab a 2-drop, most likely going to be Rezard. The thought being that he's going to pay 200 life and just remove my Distortion of Time right now. That's in the graveyard, just get it out of there. So one thing that it's kind of important to note is keeping track of, if you have like multiple rarities of a card in your deck, honestly, is keeping track of which rarity your opponent has seen, especially if you have multiple. Because you see here I've cast the full art one, but technically Trey has only seen the common one, so now I've told him through casting that one instead, I've shown him that I have 2. Whether he catches that or not is we have to decide. We can't really figure that out necessarily, but it is those little things in terms of which copies of cards you use to prevent your opponent from getting as much information as possible. So the Ray swung at me, dealing 5 damage. Might as well, it's a free board. And then trying to figure out exactly what I want to do here. I'm going to produce double time. I have a Dragon's Lord's Breath here, and I'm trying to see like how I want to deal with the Ray. I need to kind of clear the board right now, ultimately. Especially since he only has 1 will available. It is green, which is a little unfortunate, because he might have cancel spells, and I'm not particularly sure I can win a cancel war right now. But ultimately, I need to try to keep the board as clear as possible. On my turn, I think on the beginning of his turn, I think actually before he draws, producing double time with Time Spinning Niche and time with my stone to do the second awakening of Dragon Lord's Breath, which will let me bounce 2 things, one to the bottom of his deck and one back to his hand. So I get the Ray to the bottom of the deck, 0 to his hand, and then I'll let him draw for turn. Main reason I think there to cast it on his turn was to say if I do it on his turn and he cancels it, then I open him up to a Severing. If I have another bounce spell or something like that, would be the thought process. It's going to replay the Rezard. I don't really have a problem with him replaying it. It's just a 5/5 at this point, and it's going to stay that way for a very long time. Going into my turn, Shayla's Return, which is an excellent thing for me to see. Can keep a potential future Ray off the board. Calling for Stone. Some Mosasaurus and a Dinosaur surfacing. I decide to play the Lorite 7 Disciples. My thought is I can give it Barrier now, so it's protected until end of turn, and then next turn I can give it Precision and try to deal with the Rezard. Once again, I'm still trying to force Trey to tap out on his turn preferably, so by giving him this potential threat to deal with right now, it sets, it forces him to potentially tap himself out more frequently. At the end of my turn, he's going to cast the Flourishing Hope on his Rezard, so it becomes Burgeoning Despair on his side during his turn. Calling for Stone, hitting another Dark Blasting Weight. Nope, sorry, I get my stones mixed up. Hitting another Black Silence. So he's got 3 black-white and 3 black-green sources right now. Feeling very balanced. He does have that other Ray here. See him cast it. Passing the turn. End of his turn, trying to bounce the Ray back to his hand. Again, doing this on the end of his turn is the idea of maybe forcing a Cancel War here that I think I can win, thus tapping him out completely and opening him up to a Distortion, which would be excellent for me. No Lorite, unfortunately, so I am only going to gain 1 skill, choosing to gain Precision, so that I can kill the Rezard. Once again, trying to force him to potentially make tap outs before I even cast my first card for turn, so that I can then potentially follow that up and punish it by using the lock. Because I do have a Distortion in hand, so I could quickly just cast it and then immediately activate the God Art. Producing time. Paying 4 to cast Dinosaur Surfacing. Getting out the Mosasaurus. He has the Lorite. Ferris spelling the Lorite. Severing Winds. Severing Winds targeting the Lorite. A Ferris spell. Cast here. To cancel everything. So the Mosasaurus is going to have its effects negated. Unfortunately, that took a lot of will, so I won't be able to do the God Art piece this turn. But I did get to use the Lorite up, and I did get to use quite a few of his cancel spells. Was kind of maybe my thought process here. The thought was make him spend all of this stuff to stop this Mosasaurus, so that next turn I can kind of punish it with the Time Spinning Witch play. He starts to project that he's maybe doing the final battle play, but he uses Glints of Insight and calls Severing Winds. Sees my hand is Mosasaurus, Dinosaur Surfacing, and Distortion of Time, so I have 3 lockdown effects next turn. He only has 3 cards in hand. I'm doing a very good job here of preventing Trey from gathering resources. And I think that's one of the things that people have to realize against playing against Dark Trees. You have to properly kind of balance when to swing in and when to kind of play passive. If you can kind of make Tree use up its own resources before you kind of start swinging in, you're at a pretty big advantage in the fact that they have a 60 card deck, right? And so if you're taking away their card draws by swinging once they're already out of cards, it potentially becomes a lot more of a luck-based situation for them to see of, 1, I hope I didn't just get milled out of all the cards that I need, and 2, I hope what is left is actually something that I can make use of. Decides to play the Rezard here. Pays 3 to cast the Burgeoning Despair, so I'm going to lose my Disciples and my Mosasaurus, which I'm totally fine with. Leaving up only a white will for me, which is great because he's going to get at least time walked, at least for one turn, coming up here. Casting the Distortion of Time, looking at the top card of my deck. Deciding whether or not I want to keep it or not. I do have that Jupiter, which is really nice. And the problem is I'm not at enough will yet to cast it. Paying 2 and producing time to activate the God Art of Distortion of Time, which will then, you know, time walk him for a turn, so he won't get to recover. I do have a Lorite, which is nice. And then the Jupiter, which I can't make use of quite yet. But at this point, he'll only have 1 will to use on his turn, so next turn I can play a Mosasaurus pretty safely and keep him kind of out of the lock. Does draw into a Thought Control here, so he gets to make use of that 1 will. So he can get rid of a Surfacing or my Lorite. Sees that I have Jupiter and Mosasaurus still in hand. Decides to hit the Surfacing, which I think is the right call. The Lorite doesn't really do anything. The Surfacing sets it up for me being able to potentially just multi-turn time walk him, which is definitely not what he wants to do. Just gonna go ahead and swing in for 5. Take me down to 30. And then in response to no blocks, he's going to pay 200 life to remove the other Rezard and hit me for another 100 damage off of the Rezard. So it'll get pumped up. Drawing per turn. So I make an interesting kind of decision here. I decide to go for the Mosasaurus because he has so few cards in hand. My thought is that it's highly unlikely that he's going to grab the final battle. What could he potentially grab? The other card that I drew into was Jupiter. So the different play lines here is go for the lock, right? Or keep him at low cards and just set up to punish whatever he's going to do with the Jupiter, at which point I can start to gain massive amounts of value by continuously drawing cards. I go for the Mosasaurus here. By paying 5, and I'm going to lock 3 of the... Actually, go ahead and try to kill the Rezard rather than locking down his stones. So that's kind of like my thought process was, if I just wanted to kill something, I should wait to bring in the Jupiter, because then I can kind of punish whatever he's potentially going to draw. Whether it's going to be a card draw or a final battle or something else like that, I can just kind of sit and wait, and Rezard can't possibly be big enough to deal with the Jupiter, so I could punish whatever he's going to cast by casting the Jupiter, and then block the Rezard, just kill it and draw a card in the process. Set myself up for being nice and defensive. He's going to call Glint of Insight here. Just happened to be what he top decks, and he calls Jupiter, and I have both of my Jupiters. So that's just gone. My hand is now consisting of a Lorite. So at this point in time, I have massively on the back foot. I do have a Lorite to be able to potentially deal with the Ray, but he also has Tree available to be able to grab the Rezard from his RFG and kind of start recycling that over and over and over again. Swing in for 15. I kind of admit that at this point in the game, I pretty much feel like it's over in terms of it's going to be very hard for me at this point because I know that Ray is probably going to flip. So my thought is to just kind of see what happens, what I can potentially hit off of the Mosasaurus and see if Mosasaurus can kind of take me to victory just by swinging in enough times. It is a very risky situation. Thankfully, in looking at time on the clock, I still had a decent amount of time, as well as potentially being able to get to just resetting the game. by continually calling stones, which is one of the weird things that it can do, is I can just be like, well, the game's going to go long. I won game 1. Let's just reset the game, potentially get to it. So I think my thought process at this point is use Mosasaurus to try to rip as many final battles out of his RFG as possible, as well as any potential releases, until I can get to the point where I can perform Judgment and then Judgment again, reset the game, and then kind of just have a better chance, essentially, in the pseudo game 3 without having to lose game 2. Cast Kage's Moonbeam Butterfly here for a 3-drop. Doesn't even need to use Tree. The 0 has successfully flipped at this point. It's going to actually go for a 3-drop, which is going to be the Galapis, thinking he's going to go grab Final Battle, but instead he just decides to go grab Heteroclite Excalibur to just remove the Mosasaurus. There's no real point in spending life when he can just grab a 1-drop card that's just going to kill the one threat on board. It's just going to, cast it, kill the Mosasaurus. I only have 1 card in hand at this point. It's not very likely. So making the decision to play the Mosasaurus when I could have been more defensive and kind of hold my power position with the Jupiters, I think would have just been the better play line here. It is a control matchup. The lock wasn't really doing anything. He doesn't really need a lot of will when he only has 3 cards in hand. I wasn't going to get a lot of value off of it. And that's one of the things that time splitting, which can be a little bit tricky to pilot based on that situation. You see I have another Lorite in hand, as well as a Dinosaur Surfacing. Knowing that he only has 1 card in hand, I only have 1 stone to go. My thought is, when do I perform Judgment of my ruler? Do I wait until I have all 10 stones and then try to do double Judgment 2 turns in a row? Or do I try to do Judgment now to have a blocker and then do it? Or those kind of pieces. The problem is I don't really have very much life left. So I'm kind of on a clock in that sense. 0 can kill me in 3 swings. So I'm going to produce time, perform Judgment. Produce double time, use those 3 time will and 2. To cast the Dinosaur Surfacing with the Awakening, because Time Splitting can produce 1 on her front and then 2 on her back. Again, only 1 card in hand, so my thought is I can just survive a couple more turns. I cast Mosasaurus, targeting the 0 to try to kill it. And then in response to her trigger, I'm going to Lorite her trigger so that she will get, that will get negated, and then Mosasaurus will successfully kill the 0. So at this point in time, I'm like, I have to survive 2 turns. Yeah, a Red Heart's going to come out, but I've got plenty of blockers. I just need to survive those 2 turns, and then I can just reset the game. Card that he draws there, I think, is a Glint of Insight. I have 0 cards in hand. There might be a Final Battle, which is a really unfortunate top deck for me. Decides to go ahead and pass turn, so it was the Glint of Insight. Go to recover. My thought is I just have to survive 1 more turn with no Final Battle here. I'm going to call for my last stone, hit to the 10th stone. This is one of the reasons why I can definitely see why people play that spell to ramp a stone, right? So it's the idea of if I had been able to do that, her Judgment doesn't cost, or like, yeah, so it's this matter of, you would get to draw a card, I get to ramp, and I'd be able to keep her kind of recovered so she's not at as much risk. But at this point in time, I've got the Idol of Magic to potentially draw a card. I've got a lot of blockers to be able to keep her safe. I just need her to survive 1 more turn, and then I can reset the game and be in a much more powerful position kind of going into pseudo game 3. Unfortunately, the card I happen to grab here, he top decks here, is Release, which just lets him grab the final battle, which kind of essentially at this point, unfortunately, seals the game in his favor, unless my top deck using a the Idol is just the best card possible. It would need to be a Severing Winds at this point, because I'm not playing any other cancel spells in the main or in the side in this variant of the deck. Casting the Release to grab the final battle and get to draw one more card. So in this point in time, ultimately, it's kind of actually backfired to me, although he has a final battle in the grave, so he could also just use the Rezard, remove it, and then cast it with the Release. Calls the Stone. And the problem becomes, too, if I don't see the card draw off of the Idol, sure, I could sacrifice the Spirit Stones to be able to potentially draw the cancel spell to keep myself alive. The problem there becomes that if I do that, then I can't possibly do Double Judgment. And ironically enough, the card that he got off of the Release is Severing Winds, so he's like completely protected at this point. Ultimately, even with the Lowrite, what he could do is he could Lowrite the draw trigger when I try to activate the altar and just keep me locked out of the game that way too. So really, there's really no situation here where I get out of this without losing my board, at which point all the Rezards can just kind of swing in. So the Release definitely came in handy. I had gotten rid of 2 of them with the swings, but unfortunately he was able to find the 3rd. Debating how much life to spend here, the main reason being because he's got something that has precision. He could use that to kill the Mosasaurus, so then how much is he going to pay? He ends up paying 8 life after all this calculation pieces. The idea being paying 8 life is -4/-4 to everything, at which point the Lowrites will both die, the time spinning which will be a 4/8, and then he can use the Gil Lapis to kill the Mosasaurus. It'll be a trade up, but then the Rezards can team up to tag team to kill the time spinning witch. I'm gonna produce both the floating 2 greens to sack to try to draw a card. Feeling very sad about having to stay away, so I'm gonna use the Spirit Stone to draw a card, and then attempt to use one more Spirit Stone to try to draw another card. He's gonna Lowrite in response to stop the draw trigger from the Spirit Stone. I'm going to attempt to Fair Spell it. He's going to let that resolve, so I get to draw. He's setting up the Severing Winds here to be able to potentially protect against whatever I might draw into, which I think is the smartest play. He lets it all die. He's going to swing the Gil Lapis into the Mosasaurus with his precision, so the Mosasaurus will die. At least is what he's attempting to do. I attempt to play the Viola here to pump up the Mosasaurus so it wouldn't get killed. Unfortunately, he's got the Severing Winds, like he saved it, so there's the trade with the Gil Lapis, at which point he can just swing in both the Rezards at time spinning. So I look at the top card and I go, yeah, you got it, that's the end of that game. And we push into game 3. So game 3, going back on the play here, worked out pretty well for me last time, so I'm giving it a shot again. Once again, the thought is to actively try to keep all of his stuff off board as much as possible in the early game, force him to tap out while trying to deal with threats such as the 7 Disciples, and then just kind of block him out of the game turn after turn until I can just mass this board and mill out his deck very, very quickly. Trey's idea is to try to keep me low on cards and keep my graveyard as empty as possible and prepare to stop the lock as much as possible. So you see there, and threats like the Ray in the opener. He also has a Release, which is very good for him potentially in the later game once I start swinging. Early game, it doesn't really do much because he has to actually have a card to target, so it's just kind of a dead card at the beginning. Idle Magic, first turn Thought Control. He's going to see a Keys' Call, a Pharaoh's Spell, a Lowrite, and a Jupiter. Can't target the Jupiter at all. He's got to kind of make a decision here about which direction he wants to take these. ultimately, I think he decides to take the Fairer spell, if I remember correctly, which I think is the right call. Lorite is something he can answer. The Keys' call is really only going to target the Ray, and he feels like he can protect it with the Fairer spell that he has in his hand. Another Idol comes down on my turn after using the Spirit Stone. The reason why I use the Spirit Stone actively is because I can filter into green anyway with Time Spinning Witch in the Idol, and I'd rather just be able to potentially sack the stone that way instead. Before the upkeep, I don't plan on casting anything else during my turn, so I'm going to go ahead and try to push that back into his hand and then go ahead and recover. Trey definitely could have done Fairer's spell there, but I think the reason why he didn't want to burn his Energize there and potentially set himself up for the lock, where, yeah, he would have a Ray, that's great, but then he's kind of time walked and I can kind of start taking advantage and moving forward. And he knows I also have Keys' call too. So he doesn't want to just set himself up for being time walked into a Keys' call the following turn. Attempts to play the Ray again. Calling for Stone. Hitting a Time Stone. Passing turn there. Moves to recover. Attempts to trigger the Ray. Response is going to be a Keys. Keys is called to try to negate it and draw a card. And there he has double release in his hand, which again, not super great for him in the early game. And because I waited for him to recover, this is pretty good for me because I can, again, be forcing him to tap out. Attempts to response to the Keys' the Fair spell, attempts to produce to make it green, draw a card, and then Lorite the trigger from Ray. Calls Stone here. Trey can't really cast anything else this turn because he has to be very wary of Severing Winds, so he can't really afford to spend anything else until he knows more about my hand, which is a great position for me to have to put him in. Now he could swing here. Swinging for 5 seems fine, especially since Ray can't be attacked. There's really no risk to it. But the reason why he might not be wanting to cast it is because if I get a Mosasaurus, I can just target his Ray and kill it because it'd be rested. Call for Stone, hitting a Deepwood here. So a pretty good mix of colors available for me. My hand is pretty cancel heavy, like in terms of like response heavy. I do have a Mosasaurus, but I feel like it's not quite the time. It's also not really the time to do Distortion of Time because he's completely recovered. I want to wait to see what happens in terms of being able to get him to tap out more rather than just make it like a more protected my turn. My Time Spinning Witch definitely likes to play a lot on my opponent's turn, unless I'm playing something like Misty Dragon Spirit or 7 Disciples when I already have a Lorite on board. Think about playing the Distortion, but then I'm like, you know what? I have 5 stones, 6 will potentially available. It's safer for me to kind of wait and see what happens and potentially try to win a Cancel War on his turn. Force him to tap out and then use the Distortion at that point. Responding to the trigger to draw a card by using the Time Spinning Witch effect to produce green. Attempt to flash in a Lorite to stop the Ray trigger. It's going to cast the Ferris spell. My response is to play hardcast the Jupiter. The Jupiter's idea here to bounce the Ray and draw a card. I don't really care about Ferris spell at this point. I'd rather just force the Ray back into his hand and then draw a card, forcing him to have to replay the Ray. He's going to attempt to use the Lorite, and I'm going to Severing Winds his Lorite at that point as well. So the Ray is going to successfully bounce back to his hand. I get to draw a card, and now if he wants to play the Ray, it taps him out. Which again, this is one of those moments where I'm talking about where he's suboptimally positioned and potentially vulnerable to being time walked with Distortion or Mosasaurus if he wants to kind of continue to apply pressure. He's going to go ahead and play Blood Spray. This is a pretty good card for him to combo with the releases that he has in his hand because it gets cards at his RFG that he can target with the release. So it is effectively kind of like a draw 3. See, there's a Fair spell, a Glint of Insight, and a Rezard. He doesn't really have any way to stop Time Walk at this point. He is going to go ahead and say, let's go ahead and Thought Control and just see what else we have. He sees a Surfacing, a Mosasaurus, and a Distortion of Time. Ultimately, I think this was a little bit of a misplay from Trey's side. Dinosaur surfacing, sure, he gets rid of it potentially, and then he actually makes me discard the Distortion of Time, which I think is an additional misplay here. Because it just means that I don't get to draw a card, so maybe that was what he was thinking, but I also don't have to spend the initial will to get it into the graveyard. So now I can leave more will open on his turn. Leaving him at just one's available, knowing that he might potentially have a Lorite, I start to kind of think about whether or not I want to activate it. But then I realized that if he had another Lorite in that trade war we were in before, he would have definitely cast it to deal with the Jupiter. And now I do recognize that he did play the Blood Spray, so he potentially drew into one. So it's kind of like weighing the options about which one of these I want to make. Kind of dropping my cards there, but I already knew he knew about the Mosasaurus, so that's not a big deal. Going to go ahead and do the Distortion of Time Walk and take advantage by making him get rid of a lot of cards. I play the 7 Disciples as well. This is great because it's not Severing Windsable at this point because I didn't have to cast the Distortion of Time first. So I can swing in for 9, a total of 20 cards just removed just like that between them. And Lorite can swing in as well. With only having access to 1 green will, there really isn't anything that Tree can do on its turn. He can't even make me discard, so it's a pretty safe to just go ahead and swing everything in at this point. Now, oddly enough, something that I could do here, knowing that releases are a thing and there's still some potentially left, when I do the Mosasaurus this following turn, since I've already kind of got the lock going on, it could actually be beneficial for me to hit the 2 white stones so that he can't possibly cast release or something like... can't possibly cast release to draw into one of those final battles. He can't possibly cast... Moonbeam Butterfly to dig something out of his deck. Could actually be the better play. Ultimately, though, I'm kind of more generally concerned about green, so I think my thought process is let's just make it so green doesn't happen. The main phase, getting the trigger to gain everything because I still control a Lorite. Dinosaur surfacing here to grab a Mosasaurus. Targeting the 3 green sources. Hitting 4 creatures and a bunch of spells, and then in comes the Jupiter, and in comes the Lorite for another 11 cards there. So quickly taking 20 cards out of his deck. I think at this point leaving him with 3, which puts me in a very good spot considering neither of us had taken any damage yet. Hitting another final battle here. Again, this is one of those positions where probably should have just thought about locking the white out so we couldn't use release after doing the swing. I could have even swung out. So the safer play, honestly, would have been to swing out, see what got removed, and then play the Mosasaurus, so that I can make the better choices in terms of what colors to hit. So like if he had a bunch of options or threats in the RFG, then I would know to hit the white stones so that he couldn't recover and play the release. Ultimately, though, it could have not really mattered because he might have just called for stone, hit another white stone, and been good to go. He is going to go ahead and pay 24 life to just clear my board, but it sets him at just, again, 1 green source to be able to do all of that work. Has to discard at end of turn. And then I draw into a Distortion of Time. So looking at the 1 green will, looking at his graveyard, knowing what might be in there, I'm going to produce time with my Judge Ruler, flip over, produce double time with her. Knowing he only has 1 green stone, I'm feeling pretty protected in terms of I'm pretty sure I have a cancel spell as well to potentially back it up. I have the Spirit Stones to be able to dig if necessary. Cast Distortion of Time. and then attempt to activate the Goddard, at which point he goes, yeah, I don't have anything to stop it, so I'm going to get time walked and you can just swing in, and that goes the match. So huge thanks to Trey for playing against it with a Dark Tree control, and all the people who helped me build this time spinning wish list. Be on the lookout for the deck lists later this week, and as always, this is DMO73 signing off.